What's up everybody, my name is Whisk and welcome to the premiere episode of Whiskey Bitness, a series of cooking videos for foods found in different video games. In honor of the 10th anniversary and recent re-release of the Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, we're going to take a look at a recipe for Yeto's superb soup. In the game, the soup is made by Yeto, the giant yeti in the Snow Peak Ruins dungeon, as a comfort food for his wife Yeta, whom is sick as a result of exposure to the Twilight Mirror. The soup also becomes a potent healing item for Link as he finds Ordon pumpkin and Ordon goat cheese throughout the dungeon to add to the base of the soup, which is made by boiling reekfish, a fish that possesses a strong odor Link uses to navigate the perils of Snow Peak Valley in his wolf form. Now while the game does directly give us the three main components of the soup, I think the Snow Peak Dungeon chapter as a whole provides a lot of evidence to imply several real-world connections that make the soup more than a simple mixture of pumpkin, goat cheese, and fish stock. The first of these connections is the reekfish, which can be seen bubbling in Yeto's cauldron. The reekfish's real-world counterpart is the sockeye salmon, so we'll be using a combination of skin-on and skinless salmon fillets for this recipe. The other real-world influence of the soup is found in the many references to medieval France within the Snow Peak ruins, such as the suits of armor decorating the walls and worn by the Dark Hammer, and the mini-boss's weapon, the ball and chain, an exaggerated version of the French flail. Given this implication of French influence, and the need for the soup to be hearty for its use as a health item, I think using the classic French cooking techniques of making a roux for thickness and a mirepoix mix to give the soup some bite really add dimension to the soup. Let's get started. First, turn your oven on to 375 degrees to let it start warming up. Next, grab your cutting board, pumpkins, and serrated knife to start cutting the pumpkins down. Personally, I do like to include this step of roasting fresh pumpkins in favor of their richer taste if the pie pumpkins are available, but canned pumpkin can be used if preferred. Now grab a spoon and a bowl to begin scraping out the seeds and guts of the pumpkin. Hold on to those seeds, as you can plant them to grow your own pumpkins, or clean, dry, and roast them for snacking or to use as a garnish for this soup. After you've cut down all of the pumpkins, lay them out with the cut side face down on a baking sheet. I've already sprayed a little non-stick cooking spray on the pan, but we're going to also use sesame oil to coat the flesh of the pumpkin. Each pumpkin half is going to get just enough sesame oil to coat the inside of the flesh. Once you've oiled all the pumpkins, place them in the oven for about an hour, or until they look like they do later in this video. To make the roux, combine the flour and the fats, or the butter and the oil, in the Dutch oven as you see here. Roux are used in French cooking to thicken soups and sauces, but can burn easily on the stovetop, so we're going to put our roux in the oven with the pumpkins to better control its cooking. Now that the roux and the pumpkins are baking in the oven, we can get started on the stock. Fill your stock pot about 3/4 of the way with water, and go ahead and add a rough chopped onion. Now we're going to add our peppercorns. Typically we use whole peppercorns in a stock as opposed to ground pepper, so that when the mix is drained, we don't find pepper sediment in the stock. But since this stock is going into the soup anyway, ground pepper is okay if you can't get whole peppercorns. Next, let's take the celery ribs that we're going to use for the stock and give them a good wash. Celery stalks have a lot of crevices and places for dirt to hide, so be sure to clean the ribs out thoroughly. Then give them a nice twist, divide them, and put them inside of the pot. Alright, now we're just going to do the same thing for these. Rinse them, separate them, and place them inside of the pot. The carrots for the stock don't need to be peeled, just be sure to wash them before placing them into the stock pot. Now cover the pot and let it boil for about 45 minutes to an hour. Next, let's cut down our mirepoix. While I've already chopped down the carrots and celery to about 1/2 inch slices, I'm going to show you a little trick to dicing down onions. Cut half an onion several times down the side, leaving about 1 centimeter on the other side whole. This cuts through the layers of the onion and saves a step in dicing when you turn the onion vertically and cut across your previous cuts. I'm also going to show you a cooking technique to cutting herbs and leaves. Take your sage leaves and fold them together into a tight roll, and then cut the roll into small dices. This cutting technique is called a julienne cut, and is useful for quickly dicing large amounts of herbs like basil and sage. Alright, it's been about an hour now, and the pumpkin, roux, and stock are all ready for their next steps. We're going to begin by straining the vegetables from the stock pot. Use a strainer to catch the vegetables and peppercorns, and be very careful of all the steam. Darker stocks require more vegetables and a longer cook time, but for our soup, we just need a transparent amber color. Put the stock back onto the stove. You can add a little bit more water to the stock if it looks like too much water has evaporated, and then we're going to add the mirepoix mix and sage to the stock and put it back on medium-high heat to bring it to a steady simmer. While the mirepoix cooks in the stock, we're now going to focus on the pumpkin puree. As you can see, the pumpkins are pretty well roasted and the flesh has softened a lot. Let the pumpkins cool for about 10 minutes before taking a spoon and scraping the flesh from the outer shell and putting it into the blender. Since my blender only holds about 3 of the pumpkin halves, I'll have to add just 1 of the 3 cups of milk to the batch, and repeat this process 2 more times. If your blender can hold all of them, just be sure to add the milk slowly and scrape the sides of the blender down occasionally so that all of the flesh is pureed. Once the pumpkin is fully pureed and blended with the milk, it should have this bright and sunny yellow color and smooth consistency. Set it aside for now. We'll get back to it later after we check on the roux. Looking at our roux, we can see that it has become a brown roux, which means it's a good balance of flavor and thickness for the soup. Keep the pot it's in clear, as we'll soon be combining the pumpkin and stock into it. Now, unlike in the game, the fish is actually one of the last things to go into the soup. We're going to use at least partially scaled meat for authenticity, but I will show you another knife trick for scaling fish. First, cut out the very back end of the tail meat. Then, use the tip of your knife to punch a hole into the scales. You may have to work the blade a little to widen the opening. Once it's wide enough to put your thumb through the opening, grab hold of the scales. Then, place the blade of your knife at a downward angle from the back end of the fish and steadily separate the meat from the scales. Technically speaking, these scales aren't quite garbage, as they still contain some meat that can be scraped down and used in sushi. But that's a different episode. Now, while in the game the soup is shown with a whole reek fish in the cauldron, I think it's safe to say that most people are going to prefer bite-sized pieces of fish to the floaty, grungy bits you'd find having boiled off of a whole fish. So we'll just cut the fillet down to about 1-inch pieces. We'll do the same thing for the skin-on fillet. Just remember that with those scales it's a little bit tougher to cut through, so be careful. Alright, now that we have all of our fish cut into 1-inch pieces, it's time to season them with our chili powder and our cumin. Give them a nice toss around to get a good coating of the spices and then drop them in the stock pot to simmer with the vegetables for about 10 minutes before taking the stock off the heat and pouring it into the roux and pumpkin mixture. Don't worry, the residual heat will be enough to cook the fish bits without overcooking them. Lastly, we have the goat cheese. These 2 particular wedges are a brie goat cheese, and I'm using brie both because of its slight sourness and because it is a very creamy and meltable cheese that blends well with the soup. Keep in mind though that the outer layer of the wedges are a very bitter, very not good for eating wax, so we have to make sure we remove the wax thoroughly. Again, like the fish, we'll be looking for solid, bite-sized 1-inch pieces. Since these brie wedges are kind of thick, we'll be cutting them in half in addition to cutting them into 1-inch pieces. Now is the time to taste the soup and to make any personal tweaking you want to make it more suited to your taste. For me, I like to add extra cumin to the soup, but wanted this particular recipe to be approachable by different palates. You could definitely go with a more savory route with different spices, or emphasize the pumpkin by adding brown sugar or nutmeg. After the pieces of cheese have been cut and stirred into the soup, bring the mixture back to a medium-low heat. Let the mixture continue to roll on the heat until the cheese starts to melt, or as Yeto says, well, that's about it for our first episode. I've got more recipes coming up in the future and am for sure open to requests, so don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, comment, and keep in touch. See you guys later, and remember, whisk everything and handle business.